A cold, silver dawn stretched itself over Dartmoor, sending ribbons of mist swirling across the wild, rolling hills. In the air, you could taste something older than memory, something restless, something free. The drone of the wind carried 1,000 secrets, each one stitched into the endless grass, the stone fences, and the lonely, battered farmhouses dotting the land. Down in the heart of this ancient place lay the small town of Oakhaven, clinging to its traditions like an old wool coat against the elements, while the rest of the world marched on without looking back. Most mornings in Oakhaven began the same. The bleating of sheep, the distant bark of a shepherd's dog, the clatter of a milk truck bouncing down the muddy road. But on this particular morning, change was in the air. You could sense it, humming in the telephone wires, curling around the boots of farmers, prickling the skin of anyone who bothered to listen. Ellie Vance was 13, but she wore her years like armor. Out in the dew-soaked fields, with the wind tugging at her braids, she watched over her family's dwindling flock. She moved with quiet precision, hands rough from work, eyes always alert. She counted sheep the way her mother had taught her, but she counted worries too. The sagging roof, the leaking barn, her grandmother's cough echoing in the kitchen at night. Every morning, she tried to shake off those worries with the sleep, but they always found her again before breakfast. The Vance farmhouse was old and tired, settled deep in a pocket of gorse and granite. Inside, the air smelled of boiled tea and wood smoke. Ellie's grandmother, Hazel, sat at the table, her hands curled around a chipped mug, watching the world through the window. Hazel had known harder winters than this, but lately, her shoulders bent a little more under the weight. That morning, the postman brought trouble tucked inside a plain white envelope. Hazel's hands shook as she opened the letter, her eyes narrowing as she read the words from the bank. The numbers were sharp, merciless. Payment due. Final notice. The old house seemed to shrink as Hazel pressed her lips together and set the letter down, not saying a word. Ellie felt the silence settle like dust, heavy and inescapable. Outside, the moor pressed close, huge, windswept, full of stories that flickered in the pub at night. But for the Vances, it was more than legend. It was survival, and it was slipping through their fingers. That same morning, in a gleaming modern building perched on the edge of town, a very different story was unfolding. The Finch Equestrian Center was all glass and chrome, smelling of money and ambition. Its owner, Alistair Finch, moved through the halls like a man with somewhere better to be. Finch was Oakhaven's prodigal son, returned with big plans and sharp suits. His stables were full of expensive horses and even more expensive dreams. Finch's office was crowded with blueprints and maps. He leaned over a table with two men in crisp suits, his tone clipped, businesslike. The land is underutilized, gentlemen. That moor could be worth 10 times what it is now, if people would only get out of the past. I intend to bring it forward. No more backward thinking. It's time for Oakhaven to matter. His words were coated with a practiced charm, but there was steel underneath. He talked about redevelopment, about investment, but what he meant was taking, breaking, and remaking the land to fit his vision. To him, Dartmoor was just another opportunity, a wild thing to be tamed. But there was one thing Finch hadn't tamed. Not yet. And every investor in the room knew it. A black stallion thundered across the moor, mane flying, muscles straining. The locals called him Storm. They said he'd been born in a lightning storm, wild as the wind itself, smarter than any man who'd tried to catch him. You could see him, sometimes, at dusk, a ghost on the horizon, vanishing the moment anyone came close. There were stories about how he'd once saved a lost child from a bog, how he'd kicked down fences just to free the weaker horses. No one could claim him. Some folks said you shouldn't even try. At the King's Arms pub, the men nursed their pints and swapped theories. He's got the devil in him, that one. Nah, just a good head on his shoulders. Knows what's worth trusting. If Finch thinks he'll ever get a bridle on that beast, he's dreaming. Ellie listened sometimes from the corner, letting the words curl around her like smoke. She'd seen Storm, once, on a bitter December evening, standing on a hill, dark against the sky. He'd looked at her, just for a second. Something old and wordless passed between them. Since then, she'd carried that moment with her, tucked away where no one could touch it. Now, standing on the edge of her family's field, Ellie watched the horizon. The wind whipped her hair, carrying a distant sound, the thunder of hooves, the echo of something wild and free. She pressed her hand against her chest, feeling her heart drum along with it. Inside, Hazel called her in for breakfast, her voice tired. Ellie hesitated, glancing back at the moor, wishing she could run toward it, not away. In the polished stables of Finch's Center, things were moving fast. Plans for expansion, new fences, new rules. Finch paced, already dreaming of the headlines. Businessman brings order to the moor. He didn't notice the way the staff rolled their eyes behind his back, or the way the horses shied when he walked by. Back on the Vance farm, the morning went on. Ellie scrubbed buckets, mended fences, her mind drifting. She thought of the old stories, of battles not won with swords, but with patience, with listening. She thought about the debt hanging over their heads, the weight of Hazel's silence. And always she thought about Storm. On that morning, three fates spun toward each other, a girl carrying her family on narrow shoulders, a man determined to reshape the world to his will, and a horse who refused to belong to anyone. Somewhere, out on the moor, the wind gathered, heavy with the promise of a coming storm. What happens when an unstoppable force meets something that refuses to move? What happens when a girl, a tycoon, and a legend all collide in a place the world has almost forgotten? The first battle lines were already being drawn, even if no one yet knew the war had started. And above it all, the moor watched and waited, its secrets safe for one more day. A girl with the weight of a family on her shoulders, a businessman who wants everything, a horse who stands for freedom itself. Their fates are about to collide in ways none of them can predict. What will Finch do to prove his power? And what will Ellie risk to protect what she loves? Sunlight broke through a sky still streaked with clouds as the people of Oakhaven gathered at the edge of the moor. The annual country gala was in full swing, a rare day when tradition and spectacle mixed, drawing everyone from sheep farmers to city investors, all lured by the promise of food, games, and gossip. Colorful bunting snapped in the breeze. Stalls sold everything from wool scarves to rhubarb pie, and the braying of livestock filled the air with a raw, honest music. But this year, something new pulsed under the surface. As townsfolk mingled, their eyes kept darting toward the centerpiece of the day, the Finch Equestrian Gala. A field had been cleared and rolled flat beside the sparkling stables, surrounded by white tents and velvet ropes, the grass still damp with dew. At the center, a gleaming stage rose above the crowd, and beneath a banner that read, "Oakhaven, where tradition meets tomorrow," Alistair Finch stood with the self-satisfied calm of a man who believed he owned the very ground. Finch cut an impressive figure in his tailored blue suit, silver tie pinned just so. He flashed quick, practiced smiles at investors and local politicians as cameras hovered nearby. Behind him, a group of staff hustled, their faces tight with the knowledge that any misstep today would not go unnoticed. Thank you all for joining us at the Future of Oakhaven, Finch began, his voice carrying easily over the microphone. This isn't just a celebration. It's a turning point for our entire region. We're investing, we're building, we're elevating everything you love about Dartmoor. The crowd applauded, but beneath the polite clapping was a current of unease. The old-timers shifted, exchanging wary glances. Not everyone trusted Finch's vision of the future. Ellie stood on the edge of the field, hands stuffed in the pockets of her jacket, feeling like an intruder in her own home. She watched the crowd swirl around her. Schoolmates in bright dresses, city folks with gold watches, and the familiar faces of her neighbors, faces lined by years of wind and hard work. Beside her, Hazel stood stiff and silent, eyes fixed on the stage. In the shadow of all this spectacle, Ellie's mind kept wandering to the farm, the growing debt, the hollow look in Hazel's eyes, the way the bank's letter seemed to darken the whole kitchen. £5,000, Ellie thought, was a fortune. More than enough to save their home, if only there was a way. Finch raised a hand, and the murmurs died away. With a gesture, he signaled to the stable hands, who wheeled out a heavy iron gate set on thick wheels. The crowd drew closer, curiosity flickering, and then, out of the shadows of the stables, he emerged. Storm. The black stallion's arrival was electric. A ripple ran through the people, a hush falling as the horse threw back his head, nostrils flaring. Even pinned behind bars and ropes, he radiated power, his coat shining like wet coal, eyes wild and unbroken. Several seasoned horsemen edged back instinctively as Storm kicked at the gate, muscles bunching, refusing to be small for anyone. Finch's smile widened, but there was a glint of calculation in his eyes. Ladies and gentlemen, meet the legend himself, Storm of Dartmoor, the untamable king of these moors. Some say he's magic, some say he's a myth. Well, today, I'll prove there's nothing that can't be mastered. A ripple of laughter from the investors. Some of the townsfolk frowned, uncomfortable. The stable hands looked nervous, one keeping his body pressed to the far side of the ring. Finch continued, "To mark this moment, I offer a challenge. Any horseman, or horsewoman, who can put a collar around this beast's neck in 10 minutes wins a prize of £5,000, generously donated by Finch Enterprises. Fail, and the penalty is £1,000 donated to the village fund?" Ellie's heart skipped. The sum was impossible, more than their farm made in months. Yet as Finch spoke, she noticed the trainers, men with medals and ribbons, shaking their heads. One, a tall man with gray stubble, muttered, "He'll kill you before you get close." Finch raised a hand for silence. "I've brought in professionals from all over Devon, but even they haven't dared." "So who among you has the courage, or is the moor as wild and backward as people say?" the crowd murmured. Most looked away, unwilling to meet Finch's gaze or face the risk. Ellie felt the world press in on her. £5,000 could erase their debts, keep Hazel out of worry, save everything her family had built. But the danger was real. Storm lashed his tail, skittered sideways, ears flat, foam flecking his mouth. This was not a show pony. This was a force of nature. Hazel tugged gently at Ellie's sleeve, voice low. "Don't, Ellie. It's not worth it. Not for us." But Ellie couldn't pull her eyes from Storm. She remembered that cold December evening, the flash of understanding in his gaze, the way the wind had felt alive between them. She looked at the trainers, at Finch, at the sea of faces whispering, doubting, afraid. Storm tossed his head, pounding a hoof into the dirt, and the crowd stepped back in a wave. A man near the front, one of Finch's own trainers, stepped forward, rope in hand. He lasted less than a minute before Storm sent him sprawling, kicking the rope away. Another tried with treats and coaxing, but the stallion wouldn't even look at him. Laughter rose from Finch's corner. "Looks like your local legends are just that," Finch drawled, voice echoing. All myth. No muscle." A murmur swept the field. £5,000? One last chance?" Ellie's pulse hammered in her throat. She stepped forward. At first, no one noticed. Then a shout from a schoolmate. "Ellie, what are you doing?" She didn't stop. The ring felt enormous, all eyes fixed on her as she ducked beneath the ropes. Finch's lips curled, his eyes cold. "We have a new challenger, folks. What's your name, little lady?" Ellie swallowed. "Ellie Vance." The crowd erupted, some with disbelief, some with hope. Finch looked almost amused. "You sure you want to do this? It's a dangerous game for a child." "I'm sure." Finch made a show of shrugging. "All right then, 10 minutes on the clock. If you want to save your farm, you'll have to do what no one else could." Ellie stepped into the ring, her mind whirling with memories. Her mother's gentle hands, the smell of hay, the warmth of a horse's breath. She remembered what her mother had taught her. Horses listened to more than voices. They listened to hearts. The crowd held its breath. Hazel called after her, "Ellie, please." But Ellie didn't look back. In that moment, the ring was silent except for the wind and the restless beat of Storm's hooves. 5,000 pounds could save her family. But at what cost? The world spun dizzy and sharp. Across the field, Finch watched with predatory calm, certain she would fail. Storm watched her, too, wild, unbroken, waiting to see if this small, determined girl was just another enemy, or something else entirely. And as the clock began, Oakhaven held its breath. Was this courage? Or was it madness? The world seemed to shrink, the edges of the field blurring as Ellie stepped beneath the velvet rope into the makeshift ring where the legend stood. The crowd melted away, reduced to a hush of held breath and nervous whispers. Even the restless energy of the festival faded, leaving only the ticking of the giant clock on the side of Finch's stage and the steady, thunderous beat of her own heart. Storm snorted, tossing his wild mane, eyes rolling white as he sized up his new challenger. Across the field, Finch lounged near the podium, the edge of a smile playing at his lips, as if this was all a bit of entertainment. A child's boldness before inevitable defeat. Hazel's hands clutched the hem of her coat, knuckles white, her lips moving in silent prayer. Marcus Thorne, standing near the ring with Dr. Carter, looked uneasy, watching Ellie with a wary respect. For a long moment, nothing happened. Storm circled the far edge, ears flicking, hooves churning the earth. Ellie didn't move to approach. Instead, she just breathed, slow and steady, grounding herself the way her mother had taught her during sleepless nights. She remembered the old lesson, how horses felt everything, your fear, your anger, your hopes. They didn't listen to words, but to what was underneath. The trainers before her had rushed, tried to corner the stallion, to show dominance, but Storm was not a creature to be commanded. Ellie knew she had to be something else entirely. She knelt down, making herself small, as harmless as a patch of grass, eyes on the ground, careful not to look Storm directly in the eye. The crowd rippled with confusion. A few laughed nervously, but most simply watched, the silence stretching and crackling like electricity in the air. The clock ticked down, minute by minute. Ellie drew a peppermint candy from her pocket, her mother's favorite trick, always saved for the hardest horses. She held it loosely in her palm, letting the scent drift. Storm's nostrils flared, curiosity mingling with suspicion. His ears pricked forward, then swiveled back. For a moment, he seemed poised to bolt, to explode in a fit of terror or rage. But Ellie did nothing, just sat, breathing the way the wind did, never pushing, only waiting. In the stands, Finch's amusement turned to a cold, calculating stillness. The seconds bled away. Hazel's whisper carried across the crowd. "Come on, Ellie. Please." Storm edged a step closer, then another, drawn by something he didn't yet understand. His great chest heaved, flanks glistening with sweat. Ellie kept her eyes soft, never reaching, only inviting. The crowd leaned forward as one. Not a soul spoke, afraid to break the spell. At last, Storm stretched out his neck, lips quivering, drawn by the sharp, sweet scent. Ellie let him sniff her hand, feeling the warmth of his breath, the tremble of uncertainty. Her fingers never closed, never grabbed. She just let him decide. Time slowed. Ellie heard every sound, the distant call of a gull, the wind rustling the bunting, the breath of 100 onlookers stilled in their throats. Then, with impossible delicacy, Storm plucked the peppermint from her palm, crunching it between his teeth. For the first time, his muscles eased, tail dropping as if the weight of years had fallen away. Very softly, Ellie spoke, not to command, but to share her own hope. "It's all right," she whispered, voice almost lost on the wind. "I'm not here to hurt you." Storm's head dipped, ears flicking toward her. She reached out, slow as sunrise, fingers tracing the air until they hovered just above his cheek. The world waited, caught in the space between fear and faith. Then Storm pressed his nose to her hand. The gasp from the crowd was like a summer thunderclap. Even Finch stiffened, his carefully crafted mask cracking at the edges. Ellie moved with careful purpose. From her belt, she drew the simple leather collar, plain, unthreatening. Storm watched her, eyes dark and bottomless, reading her intent in every movement. Ellie looped the collar gently over his neck, never forcing, always asking. The clock above the ring flashed, a single minute left. The moment the buckle clicked, the field erupted in cheers and applause, some in disbelief, some in awe, many just swept up in the magic of what they had witnessed. Hazel wept openly, hands covering her face. Marcus Thorne let out a long, trembling laugh, slapping Dr. Carter on the back. But Ellie was still, her head pressed to Storm's neck, feeling the shiver of relief run through him. For a moment she could almost hear her mother's voice, soft and proud, echoing on the wind. Finch stepped forward, trying to regain control, voice pitched just a little too high. "Well, it seems we have a winner," he announced, but the words sounded hollow, forced. His investors clapped politely, but there was no mistaking the sting of humiliation in his eyes. Ellie led Storm from the ring, the stallion following her as if the world outside the ropes had faded to nothing. As they passed Finch, she met his gaze for the briefest instant. His eyes were sharp, furious. Ellie felt a chill, not just of rivalry, but of something deeper, something that said this was not the end, only the opening move in a larger game. Back in the crowd, Hazel hugged Ellie tightly, tears wetting her cheek. "You did it," she whispered, voice trembling. "I can't believe it, child. You really did it." But even as the town celebrated, a different kind of energy simmered beneath the joy. Finch retreated, phone already in hand, barking terse instructions to his staff. "Handle it," he snapped, his back turned to the celebration. "This isn't over. I want every detail, every angle, no mistakes." Ellie barely noticed, lost in the swirl of congratulations and relief. But the old folks in the pub that night would remember. They would say that was the moment Dartmoor changed. A moment when a girl, a horse, and an entire community remembered that some things are stronger than money. That courage is sometimes as simple as listening, as waiting, as believing in the impossible. As dusk painted the moor in lavender and gold, Ellie stood in the quiet of the stable, her hand resting on Storm's neck. He sighed, leaning into her, the wildness still there, but softened, as if he, too, understood that something bigger had begun. But outside, in the lengthening shadows, the threat remained. Finch's pride had been wounded, and a man like that would not forgive, would not forget. Ellie's victory was a beginning, not a finish line. Storm nickered softly, the sound rumbling deep in his chest. Ellie smiled, but the uncertainty remained, gnawing at the edges of her joy. She had won the day. But what would come tomorrow? And as the first stars winked to life above Dartmoor, the whole land seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next storm. The echo of applause lingered in the stone-walled streets of Oakhaven long after the sun dipped below the horizon. Ellie's victory at the gala became the talk of every kitchen and pub, her name whispered with awe and a hint of pride. Even the sheepdogs seemed to carry themselves a little prouder as word spread that one of their own, a girl with nothing but heart and quiet courage, had tamed the untamable. The following morning, the Vance farmhouse felt brighter. Sunlight spilled through faded curtains, dust motes swirling in golden beams as Hazel bustled in the kitchen, her old radio crackling out cheerful tunes. On the table sat the envelope. 5,000 pounds, crisp and real, the impossible now made possible by Ellie's bravery. Hazel's face was soft, her eyes shining with tears she tried to blink away. "Your mother would have been proud, Ellie. She always said you had a gift with animals." Ellie smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, but her heart felt heavy beneath the relief. She kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see Storm grazing quietly in the paddock, half fearing something would go wrong and it would all disappear. But the sense of celebration was short-lived. Mid-morning, as Ellie was feeding Storm in the makeshift pen behind the barn, the crunch of tires on gravel sent a jolt up her spine. A black luxury car, shining and out of place among the mud and hay, rolled to a stop at the gate. Finch's driver stepped out, suit immaculate, eyes hard. He handed Hazel an envelope, thick and heavy. Hazel frowned as she opened it, her fingers trembling. The letter was terse, coldly formal, Due to recent developments, Finch Enterprises is moving forward with redevelopment plans. All properties adjacent to the moor will be subject to review and possible acquisition. Please be advised. Hazel's lips tightened. Ellie watched as her grandmother's shoulders seemed to curl inward, the spark of the morning dimming. It didn't matter that they'd paid off the immediate debt. The threat was back, larger, more menacing. "He won't stop, will he?" Ellie whispered. Hazel shook her head. "People like Finch never do. But we'll stand our ground, the way we always have." Later, while Hazel disappeared into a flurry of phone calls with neighbors and local officials, Ellie found herself drawn upstairs, to the room that had been her mother's. It was a time capsule, old horse ribbons pinned above the bed, a faded photo of a smiling woman with wild hair and gentle eyes. Books stacked everywhere. Dust coated the shelves, but the feeling of love lingered in every corner. On the far side of the room, beneath a window fogged by age, stood a heavy oak dresser. One drawer was jammed tight, as if it hadn't been opened in years. Ellie knelt down, tugging and rocking it until it finally slid free with a groan of old wood. Inside, she found a battered shoebox tied with blue ribbon. Her breath caught. She untied the ribbon, hands shaking, and lifted the lid. Inside were relics of another time. Her mother's leather-bound journal, old cassette tapes, loose Polaroids yellowed at the edges. Ellie sat cross-legged on the floor and opened the journal. The first pages were filled with sketches of wild horses, notes on herd patterns, the weather, and the land itself. But as she turned the pages, the entries became more urgent. "Finch wants to turn Dartmoor into something it's not," her mother had written. "He'll pave over history, sell it to the highest bidder, and call it progress, but this land remembers. The horses know." Ellie's fingers traced the words, her throat tightening. She picked up a Polaroid, her mother, younger, kneeling beside a herd of shaggy Dartmoor ponies, Storm as a colt nudging her shoulder. In the background stood a younger, thinner Finch, arms folded, scowling at the edge of the frame. She fished a cassette tape from the box and dug out the old tape player from the closet. Static filled the air as she pressed play. Then, her mother's voice, soft, clear, tinged with passion. "We're stewards, not owners. The moor gives us what we need, but only if we respect it. There are some things worth fighting for, even when it feels hopeless." The tape clicked off, leaving Ellie in silence, heart hammering with a strange mixture of hope and dread. It wasn't just about Storm. Her mother had tried to stop Finch, had gathered research, had stood up for the land, and in her own quiet way, had lost. But maybe Ellie didn't have to. Downstairs, Hazel called up to her, voice shaky but determined. "Ellie, dear, can you come down? I think you need to hear this." In the kitchen, Hazel sat with the phone pressed to her ear. On speaker, the voice of Marcus Thorne came through, measured, urgent. "I heard about Finch's plans," Marcus said. "But I also heard what you did yesterday, Ellie. The town's buzzing. That horse, Storm, he's more than a legend now. People want to help. We need to make this about more than one family, more than one horse." Hazel nodded, glancing at Ellie. "What do you suggest?" "We bring the town together. We fight this as a community. And Ellie, you keep Storm safe. He's proof that the moor can't be tamed by force. Finch hates being embarrassed in public. He'll double down. Be careful." The call ended. Hazel hugged Ellie close, worry etched in her every gesture. That night, as darkness cloaked the hills, Ellie sat by the stable, Storm dozing in the straw, his breath warm and steady. She reread her mother's words by flashlight, letting them settle into her bones. Her mother had left a map, places where the wild horses hid, paths known only to those who watched and waited. In the margins, a note. "If you ever need to disappear, trust the land." Ellie set her jaw, resolve blossoming in her chest. This was her fight now, not just for Storm, not just for her family, but for everything her mother had loved. She would prove that respect was stronger than greed, that patience could outlast brute force. But outside, in the shadowy lanes of Oakhaven, the enemy moved quietly. Finch's men made calls, met in back rooms, laid plans. They whispered of sabotage, of making an example. Storm's victory had bruised Finch's pride. He would not let it stand. Ellie lay in bed that night, listening to the wind howl across the moor. She clutched her mother's journal tight to her chest, heart racing with both fear and a wild, new hope. She knew now. This was never just about a horse. It was about legacy, about choosing who you would become when the storm finally broke. And as she drifted towards sleep, she didn't see the shadow slipping through the hedgerow, moving silently toward the barn, nor the flash of steel in the moonlight. Morning would come, and with it, a loss that would test everything Ellie believed. Ellie awoke before dawn, a thin gray light just beginning to seep around the edges of her curtain. The moor outside was a watercolor of fog and shadow. For a moment everything was still, just the quiet house, the muted clink of Hazel making tea downstairs, the gentle breathing of the sheep in the pastures. Then a sharp, unfamiliar crack echoed through the morning, distant but wrong. She shot out of bed, heart thumping with a sense of dread she couldn't quite name. Pulling on boots and jacket, she rushed down the stairs, nearly colliding with Hazel at the door. Together, they hurried out to the barn. The padlock on Storm's pen hung twisted and broken, its shank wrenched in two. The gate itself swung drunkenly from one hinge, muddy tracks gouged deep into the earth beyond. Hazel let out a gasp, hand flying to her mouth. No, no, this can't be. Ellie's heart seemed to freeze. Storm was gone. The pen was empty except for a churned mess of straw and hoof prints. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, roaring in her ears. She forced herself to breathe, to look closer. In the mud, tire tracks, heavy, wide, not from any farm vehicle she recognized. In there, half buried in the churned earth near the broken gate, a small plastic tube glimmered in the weak dawn light. Ellie picked it up, a used syringe, the label still visible. She stared at it, her mind reeling. Hazel called the police, her voice shaking. Within the hour, Ranger Davies, a stoic man with a weathered face and the eyes of someone who'd seen too much, arrived in a battered Land Rover. He crouched low beside Ellie, studying the scene with sharp attention. Whoever did this knew what they were after, he muttered. They didn't leave much behind, but that's not just adrenaline in your horse's pen. He held up the syringe, brow furrowed. This is something stronger. Enough to knock a stallion off his feet for just long enough. Dr. Carter arrived next, worry etched deep into her usually steady features. She and Davies circled the pen, examining every mark. In the lane, neighbors began to gather, murmuring, outraged, afraid. News of Storm's disappearance spread like brush fire through Oakhaven. Ellie stood apart, the ache in her chest deepening with every passing minute. She replayed the night before. Every locked door, every careful precaution. She had been so sure Storm would be safe, here at home, surrounded by the land and the people who loved him. Marcus Thorne arrived, his truck rolling to a stop in a spray of gravel. He strode over, jaw clenched, his presence commanding even in the chaos. Ellie, he said quietly, this wasn't random. Finch's men have been poking around all week, asking questions about your family, the horse, everything. I've got a few contacts. I'll see what I can find. Dr. Carter knelt beside Ellie, her hand gentle on the girl's shoulder. Listen to me, Ellie, she said, voice low. Storm's tough. If they took him out onto the moor, he'll fight to get back to you. But we can't waste time. Do you have any idea where he might go if he got loose? Ellie blinked back tears, her mind racing. Her mother's journal, the map. She darted back into the house, returning with the faded pages and the sketched trails her mother had marked. She traced her finger along the winding lines, places where the wild horses went to hide, places that only those who listened to the land would know. Here, Ellie said, voice steadying as she tapped the map. If he escaped, or if someone tried to move him through the moor, they'd have to pass through Blackstone Valley. It's dense, hard to navigate. The wild herds use it to disappear. Marcus nodded, eyes brightening with hope. That's our start. I'll get a few people together. No way we're letting Finch win like this. Hazel drew Ellie into a fierce hug, her voice breaking. Be careful, love. Don't do anything foolish. I won't, but I can't just sit and wait. Marcus, Dr. Carter, and Ellie packed quickly. Davies offered his support, promising to coordinate with the police and keep the rest of the village informed. Marcus brought two-way radios, Dr. Carter carried a med kit and a thermos of strong tea, and Ellie, her mother's map in hand, led the way out into the misty, waking wilds of Dartmoor. The landscape was at once familiar and ominous, the fog curling around granite tors and tangled hedgerows, muffling sound, distorting distance. They moved quietly, every sense straining for any sign, hoofprints, broken branches, the faint echo of a horse's whinny. As the search party pressed deeper into the moor, the weather worsened. A low, steady drizzle began, soaking through clothes and chilling bone. The wind picked up, tugging at hair and maps, making voices hard to hear. But Ellie kept going, driven by a fierce, unyielding hope that refused to die. In the boggy lowland of Blackstone Valley, Marcus pointed out tire tracks. A truck had passed through not long ago, swerving, sliding in the muck. Ellie found broken brush, a clump of coarse black hair tangled in a bramble. Storm had been here, frightened, struggling. They pressed on, shouting his name into the wind, calling, searching, listening for any sign. At one point, a distant shape darted across the horizon, a wild pony, not Storm, but a good omen. The moor wasn't empty. It remembered. Hours slipped by, the sky never fully brightening. Fatigue gnawed at Ellie's legs, but she refused to slow down. She remembered her mother's voice on the tape. If you ever need to disappear, trust the land. She began to look, not just with her eyes, but with memory, with intuition, seeking the places where a hunted animal might hide. At the edge of a crumbling stone wall, Marcus called out, Ellie, over here. He'd found a fresh hoofprint, unmistakable in the mud, bigger than any pony's, sharp-edged from fear and speed. Ellie knelt, pressing her palm to the mark. The print was warm. He's close, she breathed. They followed the trail, adrenaline mounting. In the thicket beyond, the grass was trampled, the air sharp with the scent of sweat and fear. But there was no sign of Finch's men, only the moor, wild and eternal, watching their every move. As dusk fell, they reached the far edge of the valley, a lonely hollow, encircled by twisted oaks and granite boulders. Ellie spotted another clue. Storm's bridle, abandoned and torn, snagged on a low branch. Tears pricked her eyes. He's trying to get away. He's not giving up. Dr. Carter squeezed her shoulder. Neither are we. They made camp as darkness swept in, lighting a small fire and sharing out tea and cold sandwiches. Above them, the moor stretched silent, the wind whispering through the heather. Ellie stared into the flames, worry and hope battling in her chest. Somewhere out there, Storm was alone, afraid, maybe injured. But he was not defeated, and neither was she. Marcus passed around the radio, his voice calm but resolute. We'll take turns watching. Whoever did this, Finch or his hired hands, they won't stop unless we show them we're not afraid. This is more than one horse. It's about standing up for what's right. Ellie nodded, her resolve hardening. She glanced at the map again, tracing tomorrow's route. If her mother was right, if the land really remembered kindness, Storm would find a way back to her. She just had to hold on. And so, as the night deepened and the fire faded, the search party kept vigil. 3 silhouettes huddled against the cold, refusing to surrender. The moor pressed close, ancient and watchful. In the dark, the storm was still out there, but so was hope. The moor woke under a blanket of rain. Gray dawn blurred the horizon, turning the world into a misty watercolor of shifting shadows and wind-bent grass. Ellie's eyelids fluttered open to the prickling cold and the quiet hush of drizzle. Their fire was just a smolder now, barely fighting off the chill. She wiped sleep from her eyes, heart aching with exhaustion and worry. Marcus was already up, scanning the land with binoculars. Dr. Carter poured tea from the thermos, offering Ellie a cup. The warmth steadied her hands, but did nothing to still the wild beating in her chest. Storm was still out there, lost, hunted, perhaps hurt. Each hour away from him gnawed at her hope. They broke camp quickly, stuffing maps and blankets into packs. The radio crackled. Ranger Davies checking in. No sign of Finch's truck on the main roads. No one had seen Storm or the thieves in any of the nearby villages. But rumors were flying, and word had gotten out. Ellie's horse, the legend of Dartmoor, had been stolen. The moor seemed to bristle with collective unease. Ellie unfolded her mother's map again, crouching beneath a stunted oak to shield it from the drizzle. Her finger traced a route. North, past the standing stones, then east along a narrow valley choked with brambles. If Storm had managed to break free, if his captors had lost control, he'd go somewhere familiar, somewhere wild enough to hide. She remembered a note, scribbled in the margin. Rock Hollow, safe place. Horses gather here when frightened. Ellie looked up at Marcus and Dr. Carter, determination blazing through her fatigue. I think I know where to look. There's a hollow east of here, shielded by stones. Mom always said it was a sanctuary for the wild ones. Marcus nodded, trusting her instincts. Lead on, kid. We're with you. They set off into the thickening mist, boots squelching in the spongy earth. Rain pattered on slick leaves, the moor's endless hush broken only by the squawk of a distant crow. At every turn, Ellie scanned for clues. A snapped branch, a clump of black hair snagged on gorse, a fresh indentation in the mud. With every sign, hope kindled anew. 2 hours passed. Then, just as Ellie's doubts threatened to return, she saw it. A trail of hoofprints, deeper and more erratic than the ones from the day before. Mud churned in wild, frightened circles. She knelt beside them, her heart hammering. He was here. Recently. Marcus took off up the ridge, motioning for silence. They moved slowly now, wary of more than just the elements. Finch's men were still out there somewhere, desperate to keep Storm out of Ellie's hands. As they climbed higher, the rain eased, the mist thinning to reveal a narrow valley framed by jagged stones. At the far end, half hidden by a tumble of ferns and boulders, stood a lone figure, Storm. He stood, sides heaving, his coat smeared with mud and burrs. Cuts lined his flanks where he'd pushed through thorns and barbed wire. But he was alive, untamed and magnificent, eyes wide with fear and fury. When he saw Ellie, he took a halting step back, nostrils flaring. Ellie's throat tightened. She raised her empty hands, voice soft as the morning. It's me, Storm. You're safe now. I promise. She moved slowly, ignoring the ache in her knees and the pounding in her chest. She let Storm sniff her hand, just like at the gala. He trembled, torn between relief and terror, between memory and instinct. Ellie reached into her pocket for another peppermint, her mother's old magic. She held it out, arm shaking. Storm sniffed, then snatched the treat with a rough nuzzle. He sidled closer, his breath warm against her cheek. Ellie blinked away tears. Good boy. I knew you'd find your way back. Dr. Carter examined Storm, murmuring soft encouragements as she checked his wounds. He's sore, but nothing's broken. He's lucky. And smart. He got away, probably while they were trying to load him up again. Marcus scouted the area, returning with grim news. Tracks. ATVs, headed this way. They must have doubled back when they realized he'd escaped. We need to move. Now. Finch's men are close. Too close. Ellie's pulse spiked. The woods pressed in, every shadow a potential threat. Storm shifted nervously, sensing her tension. Suddenly, the distant whine of engines cut through the hush. Ellie spun toward the sound. 2 ATVs bouncing over the rise. Finch's men hunched low, eyes scanning the valley. Marcus swore. No time. Ellie, get Storm out of here. Take the hollow path north. There's a shortcut to the old quarry. Carter and I will draw them off. Ellie's mind flashed with images from her mother's map. Narrow deer trails, half hidden by bracken, winding north towards safety. She nodded, grabbing Storm's tangled mane, pressing her forehead to his for just a heartbeat. Trust me, Storm. Let's go. She broke into a run, Storm following close, half bolting, half guided by her voice. The ground was slick, treacherous. Branches tore at her sleeves, mud sucked at her boots. Behind her, she heard shouts. Marcus yelling, the roar of ATVs, Carter's whistle slicing through the chaos. At the hollow's edge, Storm balked, rearing up as an ATV skidded into view, its rider leaping off with a rope in hand. Ellie's heart stopped. No! Leave him alone! The man lunged, missing as Storm danced sideways, hooves flashing. Ellie shouted, waving her arms, desperate to distract him. In the commotion, Storm found a burst of wild energy, barreling past the attacker and into the tangled undergrowth. Ellie scrambled after him, her breath burning, her legs numb. She could hear Marcus's Land Rover growling nearby, Carter honking the horn, swerving between the pursuers and the narrow path where Ellie and Storm fled. The ATV riders cursed, caught between the truck and the maze of rocks. In the chaos, Ellie and Storm disappeared into the mist. They ran until Ellie's lungs ached and her legs threatened to give out. Finally, as the sounds of pursuit faded, she slowed, collapsing onto a mossy stone, Storm panting beside her. For a moment, they just existed, girl and horse, two survivors, alone in the wild. Ellie buried her face in Storm's mane, laughter and tears mixing as she clung to him. We did it. We're safe. For now. Above them, the moor brooded, ancient and indifferent, but somewhere in the swirling mist, hope had returned. Back at the valley, Marcus and Dr. Carter rejoined Ellie, battered but grinning. That was close, Marcus said, helping Ellie to her feet. You've got guts, kid. Carter knelt beside Storm, stroking his muzzle. And you, big guy. You're a miracle, Ellie smiled, exhaustion catching up with her. We're not done yet. Finch won't stop. But as long as Storm is free, he doesn't win. As dusk settled once more, they found a safe hollow, hidden from the road. Ellie kept watch, Storm pressed close. She traced her mother's map beneath the light of a flickering lantern, the words in the margin now a promise. If you ever need to disappear, trust the land. Ellie understood at last what her mother had meant. Home was not just the farm, but this wild moor, the courage to keep fighting, and the hope that sometimes even the lost could find their way back. Night pressed close around the small hollow where Ellie and her allies had found refuge. The fire was only a whisper against the cold, but for the first time in days, Ellie felt something like safety. Storm nuzzled close to her shoulder, his sides rising and falling in slow, even breaths. Marcus and Dr. Carter sat nearby, keeping their voices low, eyes always on the darkness beyond the firelight. But safety on the moor was never more than an illusion, and as the fire dwindled, the danger felt closer than ever. Ellie kept replaying the chase in her mind, the roar of engines, the shouts, the near capture in the tangled undergrowth. Her muscles still ached with exhaustion, her nerves stretched tight as wire. Yet every time Storm rested his muzzle on her arm, she felt her courage gather itself again. They took turns sleeping, each waking to the hush of wind and the soft shifting of Storm's hooves. Somewhere out there, Finch's men were regrouping, angrier and more determined than ever. The community was watching, but they could only do so much. Out here, it was up to Ellie, Marcus, and Dr. Carter, and the land itself. At first light, they broke camp. The moor was a tapestry of mist and dew, pale gold sun struggling through heavy clouds. Marcus checked the radio. No word from Ranger Davies yet, but news was spreading quickly. Ellie heard snippets. The whole town knew about Storm now, and more than a few villagers were rooting for them, passing on sightings and sending messages of support. Even so, the threat was real and immediate. Marcus pointed east, toward a narrow ridge where the ground rose and dipped in steep, unpredictable waves. If we can get through the old quarry and double back along the river, we might lose them for good, he said. The ATVs can't follow us through there. It's all rocks and rabbit holes. Dr. Carter handed Ellie a flask of tea and a strip of dried fruit, managing a weary smile. Eat up, Ellie. You'll need your strength. Storm, too. They set out, moving quickly but carefully. Storm's wounds were healing, but he limped slightly, the muscles in his left hind leg still sore from the ordeal. Ellie whispered encouragement, her hand on his neck, matching her steps to his uncertain pace. The bond between them had only deepened. She could feel his anxiety, his hope, his stubbornness. He trusted her utterly, and she drew on that trust like a lifeline. They reached the edge of the old quarry as the sun climbed higher. The ground here was a jigsaw of broken stone and tangled grass, sharp ridges that seemed to shift with the wind. Storm hesitated, nostrils flaring, ears flicking back and forth. "It's okay," Ellie murmured, stroking his neck. "You know these trails, don't you? You've run here before." Storm snorted, then with a shiver picked his way forward. Marcus led the way, checking for loose rocks and watching the horizon. Dr. Carter brought up the rear, casting anxious glances back every few steps. Halfway across the quarry, the distant drone of engines broke the silence. Ellie's heart lurched. She glanced back, 2 ATVs crawling along the moor's edge. Finch's men scanning the horizon, one of them pointing straight at the quarry. Marcus swore under his breath. "They've seen us. Move!" The chase exploded into motion. Marcus scrambled up a sharp incline, waving for Ellie to follow. She urged Storm onward, keeping him close, letting him choose his footing. The stallion moved with surprising agility, sidestepping loose stones, ducking through narrow gaps. Behind them, the ATVs slowed, engines screaming in protest as they tried to follow. The terrain was too rough. One rider nearly tipped over, cursing as he scrambled to right his machine. Dr. Carter called out, "Over here! A safer path?" And Marcus led the way, ducking beneath a fallen branch. Ellie followed, feeling the wind whip her hair, Storm's flanks pressed tight against her side. The world shrank to a blur of motion, up a ridge, down a scree slope, through a patch of gorse that tore at their clothes and skin. Storm stumbled once, nearly falling, but Ellie steadied him with a touch and a whispered word. The ATVs tried to double back, circling around the quarry's edge, but the path was too narrow, the rocks too sharp. For a precious minute they were alone, hidden from view. Marcus glanced at the sky, breathing hard. "We're losing them, but not for long. Ellie, is there another way through the woods?" Ellie thought fast, mind racing through her mother's map. "There's an old deer trail. Runs east, then north along the riverbank. It's tight, but Storm can make it." "Lead on," Marcus said, voice taut with urgency. They plunged into the woods, shadows deep and cool, the noise of pursuit fading behind them. The trail was barely visible, a narrow ribbon winding between twisted trunks and mossy stones. Storm moved like a ghost, hooves barely making a sound. Ellie glanced back only once, just in time to see one of the ATVs crash into a thicket, the rider flung into the mud. Dr. Carter managed a tight smile. "I hope he gets thistles in his socks," Ellie grinned, her relief bubbling up in laughter. "Me too." They reached the river, just as the sun broke fully through the clouds. The water ran swift and cold, carving a silver path through the green. Storm hesitated at the bank, nostrils flaring. Ellie whispered softly, stroking his mane. "You can do this, boy. Just like before, I'm right here." Storm stepped into the river, hooves splashing, muscles tensing at the icy water. Ellie kept her hand on his withers, guiding him across. On the far bank, they paused, catching their breath, the danger momentarily behind them. Marcus checked the radio again. Ranger Davies's voice crackled through, faint but clear. "You're almost there. I've set up a checkpoint at the old stone bridge. Get Storm to me, and we'll keep him safe. Finch's men won't dare follow past the boundary." Ellie's chest loosened, hope rising. They pressed on, following the river through open fields and tangled copses. At every turn, the land seemed to help them, branches shielding them from view, stones guiding their steps, the sun at their backs. Finally, as afternoon waned, they reached the bridge. Ranger Davies stood waiting, arms crossed, his battered Land Rover blocking the lane. He grinned as he saw them approach, relief flooding his face. You made it. And with Storm, no less. Ellie slid off Storm's back, her knees weak with exhaustion and joy. Davies clapped Marcus on the shoulder, shaking Dr. Carter's hand. We'll get Storm safe. Don't you worry. Finch can't touch him now, not with half the county watching. Ellie hugged Storm, tears streaking her dirty cheeks. The stallion whickered softly, leaning into her embrace. For the first time, she believed, truly believed, that they might win. But even as dusk gathered, and the bridge behind them closed off pursuit, Ellie knew the battle wasn't over. Finch had lost this chase, but he wouldn't stop. He was planning something bigger, something public. As they led Storm toward the shelter of the ranger's paddock, Ellie looked up at the moor, ancient, silent, and strong. She remembered her mother's words. There are some things worth fighting for, even when it feels hopeless. Ellie wasn't hopeless anymore. She was ready. The final battle was coming, and this time, she wouldn't be alone. The morning sun lit the dew like diamonds on the grass as Ellie paced the stable yard at Ranger Davies' outpost. After the frantic chase, the world felt almost unnaturally quiet. Storm grazed peacefully in the nearby paddock, his wounds dressed and his coat brushed clean. But beneath the peaceful scene, tension simmered, like the stillness before another tempest. News of Storm's escape and Ellie's daring flight spread quickly across Dartmoor and beyond. For days, villagers brought food, blankets, and well-wishes to the outpost. Some came just to catch a glimpse of the legendary black stallion. Others wanted to thank Ellie for reminding them what courage looked like. But not all attention was welcome. Finch hadn't given up. Instead, he went public. Every morning, Ellie saw the headlines. Finch announces special exhibition at Devon County Fair, a celebration of local heritage. The papers featured glossy photos of Finch smiling, arms thrown wide in the middle of his glittering equestrian center, his words full of charm and false generosity. He spoke of giving back to the community. But everyone who truly knew Dartmoor could sense the threat lurking beneath his polished promises. The county fair was the region's biggest event. Thousands would attend. Finch's special exhibition would be the grand finale. Hidden in the fine print, Ellie saw it. A demonstration of modern training methods and the unveiling of Finch's new Star Stallion. Ellie's stomach twisted. She knew what he was planning. She'd heard whispers that Finch had bought a look-alike horse, a nervous, smaller stallion painted to resemble Storm. It was the final move, a public humiliation. If the crowd believed Finch had mastered Storm, it would break the legend, break Ellie's hold on the land, and her claim to the horse. Marcus Thorne, always 2 steps ahead, was the first to call it out. He wants to crush you, Ellie. Not just take the horse, he wants to prove that money can buy anything, even magic. But we're not going to let him. Are we? Ellie shook her head, resolve hardening. She wouldn't play Finch's game. Not on his terms. Instead, she prepared for her own. With Marcus and Dr. Carter's help, Ellie dove into her mother's notes and tapes, seeking not tricks or spectacle, but connection. For days, she spent every waking moment with Storm. She didn't use a bridle or whip, just her voice, touch, and patience. She taught Storm to trust subtle cues, a tilt of her shoulder, a whispered word, the rhythm of her breath. Sometimes they just sat together in the paddock, sharing apples, watching clouds drift above the moor. Hazel, recovered and feisty as ever, arrived at the outpost with bags of sandwiches and a steely look. Finch thinks he can buy the crowd with tricks. But folk around here know the truth when they see it. We'll show them what real respect looks like. As the fair drew closer, pressure mounted. Finch's lawyers sent official notices threatening to disqualify Ellie for endangering livestock. Anonymous callers tried to buy her silence. Rumors flew that Finch's men were looking for any reason to have Storm impounded, but every threat only made Ellie more determined. On the eve of the fair, the outpost buzzed with nervous energy. Marcus secured a slot for Ellie and Storm in the main ring, right after Finch's exhibition. Dr. Carter arranged for Storm's veterinary papers to be checked and double-checked, making sure no one could block their entry. Ellie barely slept. She spent the night in Storm's stall, her head on his neck, listening to the steady thump of his heart. She remembered her mother's words. Don't try to break what's wild. Learn its language. Meet it in the quiet places, and you'll find something stronger than fear. The day of the fair dawned bright and cloudless. The Devon County Fairgrounds sparkled with bunting and banners. Vendors sold candy floss and hot tea. Children squealed on the rides, and everywhere the buzz of anticipation grew. The main ring was a riot of color. Horses prancing, judges in top hats, crowds filling every seat. Ellie stood in the warm-up yard, her hands steady even as her heart pounded. Storm shifted beside her, ears twitching at the noise but calm beneath her touch. Marcus appeared at her side, pinning a contestant number to her jacket. "Remember, Ellie," he murmured. "It's not about impressing them. It's about showing the truth." Hazel pressed a small, worn good luck charm into Ellie's palm, the same one her mother had carried. "We're all behind you, girl," the loudspeaker crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Alistair Finch and the Stallion." Finch strode into the arena, gleaming in his tailored riding jacket. Behind him, handlers led in a horse painted black, its eyes wide and rolling, muscles twitching with unease. The crowd gasped, then applauded politely, but there was an uneasy undercurrent. Finch launched into his speech, praising modern science and progress, promising a demonstration of control and obedience. The handlers barked commands, cracking whips. The painted stallion reared, eyes wild with fear, bolting to the end of his tether. Finch's voice wavered, but he kept smiling, forcing the horse to canter, then circle. The animal stumbled, panic growing. People in the stands began to murmur, their discomfort clear. Hazel, watching from the rail, shook her head. "No heart in it. Folk can see when something's wrong." At last, Finch's exhibition ended in chaos. A handler narrowly avoiding a kick, the stallion trembling with exhaustion. The applause was scattered, uncertain. Then came Ellie's turn. She entered the ring with Storm at her side. No saddle, no bridle. The crowd fell silent. Ellie bowed her head, closed her eyes, and breathed. Storm stood still, ears flicking, waiting for her signal. She lifted her hand. Storm circled her gently, then came to stand beside her, lowering his head so she could stroke his forelock. Ellie spoke softly, the microphone picking up only her quiet encouragement. She ran, and Storm followed, his movements effortless, a dance of trust and freedom. Without any command, Storm halted, then bowed his head to the audience. The crowd gasped, then burst into applause, pure, astonished, joyful. Ellie smiled, tears stinging her eyes. She wasn't finished. Ellie motioned, and Storm trotted to the center of the ring. She knelt, and he lowered himself beside her. Horse and girl, side by side, equals. For a heartbeat, all of Dartmoor seemed to hold its breath. Hazel dabbed her eyes. Marcus grinned through tears. Even the judges seemed transfixed. As Ellie and Storm left the arena, the cheers rose, deafening, defiant, and real. Finch stood in the shadows, lips pressed thin, his empire crumbling beneath the weight of one girl's truth. The world had seen what real partnership looked like, and it would never forget. The cheers from the crowd still echoed around the Devon County Fairground as Ellie and Storm left the ring, a trail of wonder and whispers following them. For a moment, time seemed suspended, the air alive with something bigger than applause. A recognition, a reckoning, a promise that everyone had just witnessed something real. Ellie paused beside the paddock, burying her face in Storm's mane, letting his warmth steady her trembling hands. But there was no time to bask in victory. As she stroked Storm's neck, she caught sight of Finch pacing furiously behind the judge's tent, his handlers gathered in a tight, anxious knot. The stallion, still painted to mimic Storm, was being led away, flanks heaving, sides flecked with sweat and fear. The crowd's applause had faded to uneasy murmurs, and people cast sidelong glances at Finch, their respect curdling into doubt. Hazel found Ellie by the fence, her face aglow with pride. You did it, Ellie. The whole county saw the difference. What it means when you trust, not conquer. Marcus joined them, clapping Ellie on the shoulder, his own eyes suspiciously bright. He can't fake that, kid. Not with the whole world watching. The fair's energy shifted as news spread of the dramatic contrast between the two performances. By lunchtime, Ellie's gentle display with Storm had become the talk of every tent and food stall, stories growing with each retelling. Finch tried to recover his footing, stepping up to the main stage with a bright, brittle smile. Ladies and gentlemen, sometimes even the best trainers face a challenging day. Our demonstration was meant to show the power of modern techniques, but it seems the true spirit of Dartmoor still runs wild. The words fell flat. People in the audience exchanged skeptical glances. Several reporters pressed forward with questions. Why was the Stallion so frightened? Was it true the horse was not Storm, but a look-alike? Finch deflected, but the cracks in his facade grew wider. Just as he finished, a commotion erupted near the stables. Storm, sensing distress in the painted stallion, let out a piercing whinny. The painted horse, trembling and wild-eyed, broke free from its handler and cantered toward the center ring, seeking comfort. Storm moved to meet him, head low, voice gentle, a horse's greeting filled with reassurance. Ellie, watching closely, stepped into the ring, careful and slow. She extended her hand to both horses, using the calming skills her mother had taught her. It's okay. You're safe. The crowd, at first startled, now grew silent, rapt. They watched as the painted stallion, recognizing Storm, drew close and pressed his muzzle to Storm's flank. The two horses stood together, calm for the first time since the morning. Ellie looked up at the crowd, her voice clear and strong for the first time all day. You can't fake trust, she said. You can't force respect. You have to earn it. Patiently, honestly, every single day. The effect was electric. Someone in the stands started to clap, then another. Soon, the applause rolled over the fairground like a tidal wave. Judges stood and nodded. Reporters snapped photos, recording every word and gesture. Finch tried to interrupt, but the crowd's attention had shifted entirely. Children pressed forward to the rails. Parents lifted them to see, and even the sternest of horsemen wiped their eyes. A woman from the local paper pushed a microphone toward Finch. Did you paint another horse to look like Storm? Why did your handlers use such harsh methods? What do you say to people who believe you tried to deceive the public? Finch's face tightened. He fumbled for a response, but every answer only raised more questions. His supporters drifted away, the foundation of his power, money, spectacle, image, crumbling beneath him. Meanwhile, Marcus approached the announcer's booth, asking for a word. The loudspeaker crackled. In light of today's events, and at the judge's request, we'd like to acknowledge a remarkable act of horsemanship and heart. Ellie Vance, would you return to the ring? Ellie's cheeks burned, but she walked Storm back to the center, the painted stallion following like a shadow. The judges, men and women old enough to remember when the moor was truly wild, stood in a line, their faces serious. The head judge stepped forward, microphone in hand. What we saw today was more than a performance. It was a lesson. This moor is not meant to be broken or bought. It is meant to be respected and protected. Ellie Vance, we would like to honor you, and Storm, for reminding us what true partnership looks like. He handed Ellie a blue rosette, not just for winning, but for embodying the spirit of Dartmoor itself. The crowd roared its approval, the sound rising into the cloud-bright sky. Hazel sobbed openly, hugging everyone she could reach. Dr. Carter joined them, pressing a proud kiss to Ellie's forehead. But as the celebration swirled, Ellie noticed Finch slipping away, his phone pressed tight to his ear, his eyes dark and angry. This wasn't just embarrassment. It was the beginning of his unraveling. Later, as the sun dipped low, word reached the fairground that videos of the event had gone viral. Footage of Finch's harsh treatment and Ellie's gentle mastery swept across social media and local news. The story was picked up by larger outlets. Girl and Wild Stallion outshine equestrian mogul, the headlines read. Dartmoor's spirit triumphs over greed. Whispers began of investigations, animal welfare officers, sponsors pulling out, angry investors demanding answers. Finch's empire, built on arrogance and illusion, was teetering. Ellie returned Storm to his paddock, the painted stallion at his side. She watched the two graze together beneath the evening sky, her heart finally quiet, her spirit soaring. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe that everything her mother had hoped for was within reach. Marcus found her by the fence, offering a flask of hot chocolate and a rare, broad smile. "You changed more than one life today, Ellie. You changed the whole moor." Ellie shook her head, humbled. "I just listened. To Storm, to Mom, to what this place needed, that's all." Marcus squeezed her shoulder. "Sometimes. That's more than enough." The fairground emptied as the stars came out. Finch was gone, defeated, if not yet destroyed. But Ellie knew this was more than a personal victory. The moor itself felt lighter, as if it too had shed a weight. The truth had spoken, not through speeches or money, but through trust, patience, and the gentle language of the wild. But as she left the paddock that night, Ellie looked back at Storm, the painted stallion at his side, and whispered her thanks to the moor, to her mother, and to the impossible bond that had saved them all. Tomorrow would bring consequences. But tonight, Dartmoor belonged to those who listened. The sun crested Dartmoor's hills, spilling gold over the grasslands and casting long shadows across the Vance farmhouse. For the first time in weeks, the air was filled with a sense of possibility. Ellie stood at the kitchen window, a mug of tea warming her hands, watching the sky change from lavender to blue. Storm and his companion, the painted stallion, now simply called Shadow, grazed in the lower paddock, their breath rising like steam in the chill morning air. Inside, Hazel moved briskly about the kitchen, humming an old tune. Her steps were lighter, her voice steadier. The old house, patched and worn but full of love, felt brighter, as if it too had shed a burden. The phone rang. Hazel picked up, listened, and then broke into a wide, relieved smile. "Yes, thank you," she said. "We'll be ready?" Ellie didn't have to ask what it meant. News had come fast since the Devon County Fair. The videos of Finch's humiliation and Storm's gentle triumph had swept the country, making headlines far beyond Dartmoor. Commentators praised Ellie's patience and the lesson she'd given the world about respect and empathy for animals. Animal welfare groups called for investigations. Sponsors and investors began to distance themselves from Finch's empire. The whispers grew into roars, newspaper exposés, leaked documents, even a televised debate about ethics and greed. The authorities acted quickly. Finch's redevelopment permits were suspended. Investigators combed through the paperwork, finding more than a few irregularities. Former employees came forward with their own stories. The more Finch fought, the more he lost. By week's end, his equestrian center closed, the gates chained shut, the gleaming signs stripped from the road. The empire that once loomed over Oakhaven now crumbled, its power scattered on the wind. For the Vances, everything changed. A delegation arrived from a national conservation trust. Marcus's doing, in part. They'd watched Ellie's story and were moved by the spirit of Dartmoor. With Marcus and Dr. Carter's help, they offered a grant, enough to pay off the farm's debts and build something new. A center dedicated not just to horses, but to teaching children and families about kindness, stewardship, and the wild beauty of the moor. Ellie stood with Hazel and Marcus as the papers were signed. She hardly dared to believe it until she saw her name in blue ink beside her grandmother's trembling signature. The Vance Center for Conservation and Horsemanship would welcome its first students that autumn. Work began right away. The whole town rallied. Old rivals put aside their differences. Neighbors arrived with tools and paint, and children lugged lumber and ran errands. Ellie found herself in the middle of it all, her sleeves rolled up, laughing as much as she worked. Storm and Shadow watched curiously from the paddock, sometimes joined by other ponies from the wild herds who, sensing safety, wandered near the new fences. On the opening day, a crowd gathered on the hill. Ellie wore her mother's ribbon pinned to her jacket, and clutched Hazel's hand as they watched the children spill onto the field, their shouts ringing with excitement. Dr. Carter led a group through the new stables, explaining the gentler, more patient approach that Ellie had shown the world. Marcus grinned from under his battered hat, surveying the transformation with a quiet pride. When it was time for the first demonstration, Ellie stepped into the ring with Storm at her side. No saddle, no bridle, just trust and understanding. The children watched wide-eyed as Storm followed her lead, dancing at a touch, pausing at a whisper, then nudging a shy little girl who had never dared approach a horse before. The crowd clapped, not for spectacle, but for the miracle of connection. Afterward, Ellie gathered everyone in a circle, Hazel at her right, Marcus and Dr. Carter at her left. She spoke, her voice clear, steady, and just a little surprised by its own strength. When I was younger, I thought being brave meant never being afraid. But I know now, real bravery is being afraid and still doing what you know is right. My mom taught me that. So did Storm. She glanced at the stallion, who nickered softly, as if in agreement. We can't always choose what happens to us, but we can choose how we listen to each other, to the land, to the animals we share it with. If we listen well, sometimes we find something bigger than ourselves. There was a moment of thoughtful silence, then applause, loud, joyful, unstoppable. That night, as the last guests departed and the golden sky darkened over the moor, Ellie wandered to the paddock. Storm stood in the fading light, shadow beside him, tails swishing contentedly. Ellie pressed her cheek to Storm's neck, feeling the slow, steady beat of his heart. "Thank you," she whispered, "for trusting me, for staying wild." In the quiet, she heard her mother's words in the wind, soft and full of pride. Hazel called from the porch, waving her in for supper. Ellie lingered a moment longer, watching the moon rise above the hills. The moor was peaceful, but alive, the kind of alive you could only feel if you'd once been lost and then found your way home. As she walked back to the house, Ellie smiled, her spirit light. She knew there would be other storms, other challenges. That was life on the moor, hard, unpredictable, but full of hope. But now, she wasn't afraid. And as the last light slipped away, Dartmoor stood proud and free, its secrets safe with the girl who had learned to listen.